This video describes the mind map that illustrates the, the national, regional, and international linkages of SDG 15 implementation. SDG 15 is part of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted in 2015, and it provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. SDG Goal 15 seeks to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. There are 12 targets that focus on ecosystem health, and there are 14 indicators that measure progress and impact. So, what does it take to achieve the SDGs, and particularly SDG 15? If we look at this mind map, we can see that it takes a lot of effort, and that effort involves actions taken by countries such as Palau that committed to implement the SDGs, to regional bodies that support national jurisdictions, to international bodies within the United Nations system, such as the United Nations Environment Program. It includes partnerships with funding mechanisms such as the Global Environment Facility, bilateral partnerships such as those of the European Union and partners, and multilateral environmental agreements such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. The SDG landscape is a complex one involving government, NGOs, private sector, and scientific bodies, and so much more. SDG 15 implementation linkages via country implementation. The Palau example. Palau's efforts to achieve SDG 15 are through its national strategies for biodiversity conservation and sustainable land management. Additionally, as a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, Palau is committed to achieving the objectives of the CBD, which includes terrestrial biodiversity and ecosystem conservation and protection, which is the focus of SDG 15. This just shows that Palau is a party to the Convention on CBD. Achievement of SDG 15 requires conservation and sustainable land management actions on the ground. As a developing nation, Palau's efforts are supported by a number of financing mechanisms. The first is the Global Environment Facility. The Global Environment Facility is a funding mechanism for the Rio Conventions. These are three multilateral environmental agreements. The Global Environment Facility gets its funding from GEF donor countries, and these include countries such as developing countries such as the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, and countries with economies in transition such as Brazil, China, Indonesia. Those countries are both donors as well as recipients of Global Environment Facility funding. Palau also gets funding for its SDG 15 efforts through bilateral relationships. So sometimes Palau will get funding from, let's say, the USAID, which is an aid program of the United States of America. Or it gets funding from private foundations, such as the Packard Foundation. This foundation funds a sub-regional program that Palau routinely targets to fund projects on the ground. Implementation of actions to achieve SDG 15 requires that we assess our progress and impact. Um, so, there are many organizations that are part of this mind map that are specifically focused on components of the SDGs. In this case, the IUCN um, has a lot of work that looks at indicators to see if SDG efforts are progressing or to assess the impact of those efforts. The United Nations Environment Program has a sub-program called the World Conservation Monitoring Center that looks at indicators for a lot of SDG work, particularly the biodiversity focused efforts. Um, Shows you where that is. Implementation of actions to achieve SDG 15 require that we assess our progress and impact and report on it. The Division for Sustainable Development Goals with the UNDESA is the secretariat for SDG implementation. And in our part of the world, because Palau is a member of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, so it reports its progress to SCAP. So, how is Palau and the Asia Pacific region doing with respect to the SDGs? Well, according to the Asia and the Pacific SDG Progress Report of 2022, we are lagging behind. In fact, here's SDG 15 right here. Not much progress. And the report further went on to say that for the Asia Pacific region to achieve the 2030 program of work, it would take up until 2065. So that's not very good at all. So to summarize, the SDG 15 implementation mind map is a varied landscape that involves multiple players at multiple scales. At the national level, the Republic of Palau implements biodiversity and sustainable biodiversity conservation and sustainable land management actions on the ground. And it does so through funding support through its partners, whether it's bilateral relationships or private foundation support, such as the Packard Foundation that funds a Micronesia Challenge Conservation Trust. This is a sub-regional trust. Or it uses funding support from the Global Environment Facility that funds multi-year projects on the ground that delivers biodiversity conservation outcomes that are actually milestones to achieving the SDG 15 targets. It assesses its progress with support from the IUCN and the WCMC, and it reports back to the MEAs of which it is a party, such as the CBD, or it reports back to SCAP. SDG 15, as we saw previously, is progressing in fits and starts, but it's progressing. And some days that's all we can do.